The second session will discuss maybe both the status and the future of political Islam. We have two representatives of Islamist parties, one from Freedom and Justice Party in Egypt, and one from the Development and Justice Party in Tunisia, in Morocco, where we actually have a current sitting Minister of Communications from the Moroccan government. I'd like first to address my question to Wael Hadara, who was, you were or still is an advisor.
I still am.
You still are an advisor.
Hard to advise a client.
Yes,
who's unavailable.
of ex-President Morsi of Egypt. And while if we look at the Muslim Brotherhood's fortunes in Egypt, they have witnessed almost meteoric rise, as well as a fall in the short 3 years since the uprisings. Certainly part of that was influenced by the military intervention in Egypt. Part of it, it seems, is a reflection of a genuine loss of support, if you will, as a result of the Muslim Brotherhood's performance in governing Egypt in the last few years. If I were to ask you to give a self-criticism or assessment of what the Brotherhood has done right or what it had done wrong in Egypt, and if I were to ask you to maybe project what path will the Brotherhood take in the future? Is it going to be a reassessment in terms of changing their tactics? Is it going to be a more radical or more peaceful path? How do you see the Brotherhood moving from this point on in time in Egypt?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I've participated in a number of forums of this nature recently, and I feel that I keep having to clarify that I've never actually been a member of either the MB or the FJP. And so, I think the very fact that I've become in many ways the point person on this issue reflects the situation that Egypt is in. And it impacts directly the ability to engage in self-criticism. Because when the principles themselves are unavailable and unable to both reflect and speak freely, I think the exercise becomes a bit limited. So I'll give my observations over, particularly about the last year and the president's year in office, as they relate to the questions that you've raised. But I want to start with one of my favorite quotes from Kenneth Burke, who was a famous rhetor. And he says that every way of describing is also a way of not describing. And so in a similar way, every way of seeing is a way of not seeing. So we can talk about the meteoric rise of the MB and the precipitous fall, but I would say that we have to caution that view. We have to cushion and be cautious about that view in much the same way that Hussam talked about, what is the public mood about rights? So are we talking about an arena, political and social, in which the MB and the FJP were moving in a vacuum? They were the only players. And what has happened is largely, if not solely, the result of their decisions and their actions. Or were there other local as well as regional and possibly international players adding to what was happening in Egypt? And I think clearly it's the latter. There are regional players as well as local players that have had a very vested, declared, persistent, strong interest in seeing things turn out in a particular way. That is not to say, in any shape, way, or form, that there were not mistakes made. But again, and I can enumerate these mistakes, and I was having a conversation with Emil last night, and what I said to him, and I'll say it again, is that for every mistake that anyone else can tell me about, I can give you 5. And in fact, my beef with some of the external observers to the presidency is that they fixate on the wrong things. What I feel are the wrong things. There were fundamental errors that were made during our year in office that really were very problematic, and I think contributed to a loss of confidence and contributed to where we are today. Having said that, there are 2 questions that arise that follow from this, saying, look, there were many mistakes made, some very fundamental, that require an analysis of were these mistakes because of a particular worldview, were they because of competency, were they because of the circumstances and the pressures? Those are important questions to ask. But the other important question to ask is, should those mistakes have led to where we are today? And I think categorically the answer is no. Nothing that is unfolding today it can be justified in any shape or form by the mistakes that were made. The mistakes that were made were fundamentally political in nature, and I would argue that they must have been expected, should have been expected, given Egypt's political development. Yes, the Freedom and Justice Party had some depth in terms of political participation. They participated in a number of elections prior to the revolution. They had experience in parliament. They had experience in the niqabat and the professional syndicates in particular. But the reality is that all Egyptians really need to confront is that all of the political activity prior to the revolution was of a kind that we should not learn from rather than should learn from. What was needed after the revolution was a new kind of political spirit, was a new kind of set of skills. And I think everyone, not just the MB or the FJP, perhaps did not move quickly enough with that change. We're in DC. I don't want to be unkind to the American administration, but if we pause to look at the rollout of the Affordable Health Care Act, or if we look at how the Syrian file was handled, particularly around chemical weapons, and whether or not that was just an accidental remark by Secretary Kerry to say if chemical weapons can be gotten rid of, then we have somewhere to go, and how that file sort of changed, or even the last 48 hours as the Iranians were invited and then disinvited. I would argue that the political mistakes made by the presidency, by the president's team, are not entirely unheard of in the world of diplomacy, even with administrations that are infinitely more experienced and infinitely more stable. So, to summarize, yes, there were mistakes. Some of them, very fundamental. In a mature political setting, those would have been dealt with in a political way, and the consequences of that are not, or what we're seeing today is not a consequence of those mistakes, but rather I feel, a set position on the part of other players. And in terms of the violence issue, I think we've already seen a preview of what we can expect. Almost every day, but certainly every week of the last 6 months, there have been a number of protests and demonstrations, not exclusively led by, but participated in by the MB and the remnants of the FJP against what is happening in Egypt. Those demonstrations on a daily basis are largely peaceful on the part of the protesters. Every one that goes out comes back with, a few people that have died, and yet we don't hear of any violence by the protesters, and the protests continue. So I think the opposition by the MB will continue to be largely, if not entirely, peaceful. That does not exclude the reaction of other people. There was an elegant piece in the New York Times early on describing the reaction of both Libyans and Syrians to what happened in Egypt, saying that armed groups in Libya for now are entirely refusing to disarm because they point to what has happened in Egypt as an example. And the Syrians are essentially turning around and saying, well, this is what happens when you go the route of pluralistic democracy. So for that could happen within Egypt itself, with some people resorting to violence. But I would submit that 6 months into it, we're seeing largely peaceful opposition. I'll stop here.
Well, just a quick follow-up. Would you agree or disagree with the notion that many have that both the Muslim Brotherhood and the secular forces in Egypt are so far behaving in a winner-take-all strategy, and that particularly with the constitution writing process, both the Muslim Brotherhood and the secular elements are trying to push forward the constitution that only meets their needs to the exclusion of all others? Is that a fair assessment, or you have another one?
I don't think it's a fair assessment at all, actually. I think there's a lot of revisionism to that narrative. And if we purely take the constitution writing process, the president himself stated very clearly that the push for the first constituent assembly was wrong. It was a mistake. They should not have pushed for a constituent assembly that was reflective of parliament, and they should have been more accommodating. So clearly that was a mistake, and acknowledge that in public. But the second constituent assembly was formed with the agreement of all the major political parties. It was the Sayyid al-Badawi that announced the formation of the assembly. He had almost all of the so-called secular political parties behind him with that announcement. And the work of the committee continued for several months without any problem. And there was an agreement on a majority of the articles. I think at the end of the day, what people disagreed on vehemently came down to about 10 or 11 articles. I was remarking earlier that my English is kind of deteriorating. I want to say شاهد في الموضوع.
What is it?
شاهد في الموضوع. The point, the interesting point, the interesting point in all of this is that the party, and let's be very, very explicit, the party in the Constituent Assembly that was pushing for less and less accommodation, that is a Noor party, somehow magically emerges as the partner in the post-coup regime, and the party that was willing to make compromises around things like Article 219 and others. The FJP becomes the terrorist entity. So, I think sort of distilling the narrative down into saying no one was willing to accommodate each other is, again, I think ignores the role of at least regional and some local players in this case.
Okay, thanks, Wael. We turn to a different experience in Morocco, where the Islamists are, the major partners in a coalition government in Morocco, and where the evolution of their thinking and experience has taken a different path. We have with us the current Minister of Communications in that government. Mustafa, if I may, you are part of the government. The Islamists are now the major partner. The sky did not fall down after they came to power. Things seem to be, moving smoothly. In fact, to the point where some have accused your party of being too accommodationist with the monarchy, and others have said that real power still resides with the monarchy in Jordan. How do you assess this experiment? Can reform from above work in a country like Morocco, as it seems to be, at least so far, working?
Thank you so much for inviting me to debate and to share with you some ideas related to the Moroccan experience. I think what is happening in Morocco is totally different to what happened and what is also happening in many countries in the region. the most important thing that from the beginning we chose in Morocco to develop what we call the third path between revolution and the old system of governance. It's making the necessary reforms without losing the stability. And it's a critical equation to implement the necessary reforms without losing the stability of the country and of the system. Now, 3 years after the development of this approach, I think the answer to your question that we are succeeding. We are succeeding, even that the challenges that we are facing are so tough. It's not an easy process, but the model is working. We faced some challenges or some crises during 2013 when one of the political party decides to quit the coalition, but we succeed in making a governmental reshuffle and to continue our experiences. How to explain this? What's the reason behind this experience? And what's the and after the second question, what's the aspect of this reforms agenda? The first reason that from the beginning, and the beginning for me, is since the 80s and 90s, not only, we developed the idea that the role of monarchy is so crucial in the stability and the unity of the country. And to succeed in making the necessary reforms, we should work under the leadership of the monarchy and in cooperation with all institutions. This is the main idea that now is driving our political line or political platform. And it's so important to emphasize this. The crucial role of monarchy in leading the reforms. And this is what happened with the Arab Spring. Since the beginning of, I think in the second month, in March 2011, His Majesty presented a roadmap for reforms in a historical speech. And based on this speech, we decide in Morocco to start by having the constitution. And this represents the second element in the Moroccan model, that we adopted the constitution before the election. The problems that had emerged in many countries, that they need, after the election, they need to make decisions on ideological issues that create some polarization and weaken the process of reforms. In the Moroccan case, we started by the adoption of the constitutional framework. This is what happened in July 2011. The election had been organized in November 2011. And this, I think, helps a lot the Moroccan experience. Now, if there is any problem, we go to the constitution. So we have a framework. And this, one of the outcomes, and also represents a factor that explains why Morocco is totally different from the other experiences, is that this pushed the government to focus more on economic and social issues. Because the people in the ground, the society, are looking to see the impacts of the reforms, political reforms, on their daily life. Issues related to job creation, economic stability, attracting foreign investment, reforming educational system, providing health care for poor people. This is critical. These are the most critical issues, and the people are waiting to see your policies in dealing with these issues. So when we succeed in adopting the constitution before the election, this pushed the government to give the priority to all these policies issues. And the main, the political dynamic now in Morocco, I think 60 or 70% of the dynamic, it is related to the reforms to this policy, related to these policies. Job creation, economic stabilities, the reform of the state subsidies, the educational reforms, health reforms, all these issues. So many factors helped in pushing the Moroccan process toward reform toward this direction. The direction that oblige all political parties and actors to enhance the culture of cooperation between them. So we have the decision and the vision of the PGD that we should and we need, and to work under the leadership of the monarchy. We have the adoption of the constitution before the organizing the election. We have that the priorities of the government are mainly economic and social. And beside all this, we have a legacy of long-standing political participation of the PJD and within the political and electoral system. Before the election in the establishment of the new government in 2012, January 2012, PGD started participating in the electoral process in November 1997. So 15 years before ago. And this helped a lot in establishing channels of communication and mutual understanding with the other political parties. And for this reason now, who is in we have an Islamist government? No. We have a coalition. And within this coalition, we have a leftist party, liberal party, a nationalist party, and PGD as a political party with an Islamic reference. So it's a coalition. But how we succeed in developing this coalition? One of the reasons is the practice of pluralism within the parliament with other political parties for almost 15 years. There is other elements that helped, but one of these elements is this. So to give a summary of the factors that helped in developing the Moroccan story or Moroccan experience is we have the crucial role of monarchy. We have the legacy and of political participation of the PJD within the parliament and within local councils, and we have the adoption of the constitution before the elections. So, and we have the economic and social challenges that oblige the government to focus on it instead on focusing on ideological issues. Now, what happened after with these factors that explain the specificity of the Moroccan experience is 3 years after the Arab Spring, 2 years after the establishment of the government, what's the results, what's the outcomes? One of them is the ongoing process of the implementation of the new constitution. We succeed in launching a national dialogue about the judiciary reform. And now two very important new organic laws related to the judiciary reform are now in the public debate. One of the elements of these two organic laws is the issue of making real separation between the executive branch and the judiciary branch. Until now, the Justice Minister is playing a crucial role within the High Council of the judiciary system. The drafts of the new laws, no representation of the executive branch in the High Council of the judiciary power. This is one of the results. Ending that the civilians could be examined or tried within a military court. And this is a very important move. And recently, His Majesty visit to United States, the joint statement, the President Barack Obama welcomed this decision to end that the civilians will be tried in military court. This is one of the results, to have a new legal framework related to the judiciary system that reflects democratic principles and merely the issue of the separation between executive branch and the judiciary branch and the independence of the judiciary system. One of the outcomes is the new press code, the draft. Until now we are debating this, but one of the aspects of the drafts of the press code is the abolition of the criminal articles. We are heading to decriminalize the press code. Also, the issue related to the civil society. We launched the national dialogue concerning the civil society in Morocco in order to strengthen its independency and effectiveness and its relationship with the parliament, the right to present proposals and to defend the minorities and groups in the society. And now the dialogue about civil society in Morocco is progressing, and the ministry has nominated one of the scholar but also the political figure from the leftist party to lead the dialogue about civil society in order to develop a new legal framework for the civil society to enhance and to respect its independency. This is one of the results concerning the implementation of the new constitution. Concerning the economic and social level, I think we succeed in maintaining the economic stability of the country. After 2 years, the deficit now is about 5.5%, and this it was huge achievements based on the evaluation of the IWMF and World Bank and IMF and World Bank. We succeed in maintaining and stopping the deterioration of the macroeconomic situation of the country, and we made very difficult decisions concerning the subsidy system, state subsidy system in the country. But beside this, we succeed in stabilizing the rate of employment. This is a success, because this means that we provide more job opportunities in the society. We launch some reforms. One of them concern the healthcare system to provide free medical aid to poor people in the society. And the program started in March 2012 under the leadership of His Majesty, and now is working. But one of the challenges that we are facing is the economic environment of Morocco, and mainly in Europe, are presenting real real challenges to the Moroccan economy. But we worked to strengthen the Moroccan relationship with the European Union as a part of the foreign policy of the country, and this has positive impact on dealing with the challenges of the economic environment of the country. Finally, one of the results is the development of the new policy concerning the decentralization of power, moving part of the powers from the center to the region. This year we started by last year and until now by a project concerning the Sahara region in the south, in order to move part of the attributions and powers to the region to deal with the economic and social challenges. And one of the reforms that we are looking to implement this year is the decentralization reform, to develop a new legal framework to the parliament in order to implement the new constitutional provisions. And this will accompany the budget reform and that has been adopted yesterday by the Council of the Ministers concerning a new organic law on the budget. So many reforms now is on the table, and the government is working to implement it. Are we facing other challenges? Yes, the issue of good governance, the issue of job creation. We succeed in maintaining the rates of employment, but for the future now is one of the problems. I think I covered the main issues. So it's not an issue of a reform from the top to down or down to top. It's a dynamic process of reforms that we are working to implement it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mustafa. In the interest of time, I think I will take maybe a few questions at a time and then allow the presenters to respond. We have a judge, member of the judicial branch in Egypt, Judge Youssef Rauf, if you can, please.
I just have two questions for Wael. One relates to the past and one relates to the future. The first is why the Muslim Brotherhood failed. The second question is about Is there a clear strategy for the Muslim Brotherhood for the coming years and the coming months in Egypt, considering the new legitimacy that the current regime has gained by voting yes from about 20 million Egyptians?
Okay. Abdul Ghani?
I hear from our colleague from Morocco that the Islamists have had experience in government, and in Yemen they had experience since '93. The leaders of the Yemen chapter of Muslim Brotherhood wrote to the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, pleading with them not to assume power, or if they do, to go in a grand coalition. And obviously that didn't work, and now is the result. Why?
So,
Well, was that any other questions? Let me add. Sorry, Sarah.
I'm not quite sure how to put this succinctly, but I kind of want to go back to what Tom suggested and just re-ask again a little bit about social justice. We've had a lot of conversation about political dynamics, whereas these revolutions, we also heard the word rentier state, which was really interesting. So what I'm hearing, even the degree to which we're talking at all about economic and social policies, if anything, I'm hearing austerity. What I'm not hearing is any kind of better controls over members of elites who captured a disproportionate amount of, shall we say, the common weal. So what I'm not hearing in anyone's discussion of what their policies are is whether that's on the table. That's different from austerity, which tends to impact the poorer. What is being done in terms of holding both overturned members of the elites accountable or restricting the access to current members of the political and economic elite to a disproportionate access to resources?
Steve, please.
For a while, a very quick question. You talked a bit about the experience of the Ikhwan in power and suggested that there were some obstacles that impeded learning on the part of Morsi and his closest advisors. I'd like to hear a bit of elaboration on that, because it really isn't so clear to those of us watching from the outside why some of the initial mistakes of the Morsi administration did not produce faster learning, better adaptation and response.
Let me add one more, Wael. We're bombarding you today.
That's okay, I'm used to this.
But no, in my book, I talk about an interview that I had with Khairat Shater in June of 2012. And Khairat Shater told me then, and I'm quoting here, "Our economic situation is in dire straits," he said. 40% of Egyptians are under the poverty line, 12 million Egyptians out of work. The economic situation must be at the top of the priorities of any president. He also said he did not believe that any single force can or should assume responsibility for the management of the country during the next 10 years, a task that he believed must be assumed by a broad coalition. None of this, of course, took place. The Brotherhood assumed the presidency, a majority in parliament, all what Khairat Shater told me was not applied. So I'd like your reaction to this also.
So I sometimes feel that we're living in alternative universes, because and I'll preface this by saying I'm not an economic advisor, and my knowledge about the economic sort of side of things is limited to our discussions as the team. But let me say the following. The issue of social justice, the discourse of the presidency and the economic advisors to the president, Hussein al-Qazzaz, the sort of the development and economic advisor, was based on a statement that the economic regime, the economic policies of the past, decade or more, were led to the development of an extractive, exclusionary, socioeconomic political system. and that the priority for the incoming administration, Morsi's administration, is to deconstruct that extractive, exclusionary process. The primary impediment to that in terms of implementation was the realities on the ground in terms of what you're dealing with in terms of the sequencing of it. So, for example, the issues that we were dealing with were, how do you tackle a budget deficit that is not small, 12% of your budget at the time, combined with half or more of that deficit accruing from subsidies to fuel and food, combined with a very high unemployment rate, particularly among young people, combined with a bureaucracy that is at least 10 times as large as it needs to be when you compare it to other bureaucracies around the world, and so on. And so the main planks of the economic approach to deal with this was to do four things. The first, and I wish Hussein was here because this is really his forte, but the first was...
He was here, by the way, last year. Was it? We had them.
Yes, he was here last, as was Khalid al-Qazzaz and Assam al-Haddad and others who are now no longer here. The first plank was to try to attract foreign direct investment aimed specifically at creating jobs. The condition on which we would attract that foreign direct investment was that we would fight the approach towards austerity. And the president tried, in fact, a number of times in terms of negotiations with the IMF. And one of the reasons why it might have taken, a little bit of a longer time that it should have was fighting on the issue of sales taxes and things like that. The second was to specifically target medium and small and very small-sized enterprises, both in terms of funding as well as logistics. The argument that in a place like Egypt, small and very small enterprises disproportionately have an effect on employment and income, and disproportionately in less advantaged people. The third plank was to restructure the subsidy regime in a way that does not affect the recipients. So the estimate that was given at the time that I'm aware of is that only about 20 to 30% of the subsidy regime actually touched the people who were in need. The rest was lost either by the way it is done or through corruption. And just as an example, when it comes to fuel subsidies were applied to the top. So the government buys oil on the international market at international prices and then turns around and sells it to wholesalers at a subsidized price. What that means is that any user, any consumer benefits from the subsidy. And it doesn't take a genius to understand that the more affluent you are, the more likely you are to benefit. And it also opened the door for corruption because it became obvious that there were entities and individuals who were turning around and actually selling subsidized oil at fair market prices. So by reforming the subsidy, the goal that was made at the time is to reduce the amount of money that is spent on subsidies to about 50% of its current rate, but ensure as much as possible that is consumer level subsidies. So in fact, to raise the amount of money that is being spent in absolute terms to disadvantaged people. And I have to say I forget what the fourth plank was. But the point that I'm trying to make is that in fact that was a focus of the administration for a long time, and our international visits were almost exclusively aimed at the economic rather than any other issue. And you saw that in the first visit of the president was to the EU and to Italy, respectively, two of the largest trading partners, Brazil, India, China, and so on and so forth. So I don't think that we neglected the economic agenda at all. I think that, in fact, it was a main focus for the presidency. And I think that the general principles on which the approach was built was reasonable. There are a lot of details that I can get into, but I don't think that that's helpful in terms of the kinds of obstacles that we ran into, including within cabinet itself. The other question, was what kind of impeded learning. So it was It was a complex situation, and I'll give you three different reasons that were operative in three different stages. The first one is that when the president assumed office, we discovered, it took us about a month to discover this, but we discovered that there was no Egyptian presidency before. So, and literally, it was a process of discovering. So literally, from February 11th, or really you can say from January 28th to June 30th, 2012, so a year and a bit, there was literally no presidency, right? The country was run out of SCAF, and the bureaucracy that is the Egyptian presidency had essentially melted away. But then what we discovered after that is that the Egyptian presidency was really had not been really truly functioning as an institution since 2005. And some people would say since 2003. The president stayed at home most of the time. He would come into the office maybe once a week, generally to meet people. And Zakaria Azmi was sort of running the show, but it was being run very much out of the security establishment. Abdeen Palace, one of the main presidential, had not been opened or set foot into since 2005 when Vladimir Putin visited Egypt. So there was no infrastructure. When we walked into the Ittihadiyya, we discovered that the wireless network was unsecured. Right, so the wireless network was unsecured. If you sat in Heliopolis Palace cafe across the street with a good enough router, you could probably pick up a signal.
They also use Gmail.
And I mean, there's a long list of issues around this. So that was the first kind of sort of issue. Now, in response to that, what you should have done is you should have had a very strong administrative component to your team, and that just was not there. It didn't really actually come into play until later in the year, say probably around December, January, where the just pure administration, someone who's actually doing HR, et cetera, got into the mix. The second element that I would say impeded learning is that as of really from the beginning, there was a crisis management mode that people were living in. This started in August 5th with the deaths of 30 soldiers in Rafah. August 8th was the military funeral for those soldiers at which Hisham Kandil and Abdel Al Maftuh and others were attacked, and the president had to abort, followed by the August 12th decisions, followed by the revolution of August 24th by Mohammed Abu Hamid, in which for the first time the protests moved from Tahrir to Al-Ittihadiyya itself, followed by the demonstrations on October 6th, etc. So every couple of weeks, every 2 or 3 weeks, you had something that you were trying to manage. And again, the learning, which didn't really become concrete until about January, was to cleave off crisis management from the tasks of the presidential team into a dedicated group. So they dealt with crises and the rest of the team carried on. In the beginning, it was all kind of sort of all hands on deck kind of an approach. So this is just a sample of what the real issues on the ground were. You could argue that, other people could have done a better job, possibly. But I don't think it was unexpected or particularly strange that this is how things evolved. Does that give you sort of some perspective? Yeah, sure.
Let's continue the conversation maybe over lunch. Mustafa, any last words before we break for lunch?
I think nobody was questions.
My question was to you too, definitely.
Yes.
To everyone.
No problem.
Every country.
I totally agree with you. That the main problem that we should don't forget the essence of politics, that we are in office to serve people in the ground. And one of the issue is the question of the wealth and equality, and to enhance access for poor people. One of the reforms that has been undertaken by the government is the issue of the subsidies. Based on an investigation that has been done by an independent institution in Morocco, only 9% of, less than 10% of the budget goes to the poor people. The main reform of the state subsidy system is that not only 10%, 100% should go to the poor people. So this is the one of the reforms. But it's very difficult. It's not an easy reform. We launched these reforms in the middle of 2012, and still until now we are debating the content of the reforms within the coalition. But this is the goal of 2014. With the coming of the government, we make many decisions related to the social policy. For example, we established a mechanism to provide direct financial aid to divorced women. We didn't receive aid from his ex-husband. After, now we decide to, for example, to double the scholarships by 50% for the students. Decisions related, for example, to the poor families in issues related to education. Now, more than 800,000 kids are receiving direct financial aid, and mainly in rural area. The minimum wage for retired people, we decide to increase it to at least almost $120 each month. Decisions like that. And we made a lot of them.
Has anyone gone to jail?
Many now, there is many...
Any senior officials or senior heads of contracting, public works companies or anything like that?
Concerning good governance and fighting corruption, there was some decisions related to this. And if you follow the Moroccan media press, you may found many cases related to this. But the issue of good governance, until now, we didn't develop a comprehensive strategy to fight corruption. We made some decisions, but it's not enough. And recently, after the Transparency International submitted its international index, the chief of the government, Mr. Ben Kiran, said that we should recognize that we didn't work much enough to fight corruption, and we still work. And one of the goals of this year is to develop this comprehensive strategy against corruption.
Okay, thank you so much, Mustafa and Wael.